Imagine being born into royalty, trained from childhood to rule, negotiate, and survive the brutal politics of ancient courts, only to discover that when Rome conquered your kingdom, your crown meant nothing. Imagine learning that for Rome, your body was not just a person, but a symbol to be broken. This is not a story about romance or glory. This is a story about power, humiliation, and what Rome did to make sure defeated queens were never remembered as rulers again. Before we go any further, if you want more stories that strip away ancient myths and expose the psychology of empires, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the History Veil, and share it with someone who believes Rome was built only on discipline and law. Some truths survive only when we choose to look directly at them. Rome did not simply conquer lands. It conquered narratives. When Roman legions defeated an enemy kingdom, the goal was not just military victory. It was psychological domination. Kings were executed or paraded in chains. Cities were renamed. Gods were replaced. And queens, especially captured queens, were treated in a way designed to erase authority itself. In Roman thinking, a defeated queen was dangerous even in captivity. She represented continuity, memory, legitimacy. As long as she lived with dignity, rebellion could survive in imagination. Rome could tolerate dead enemies. It could tolerate enslaved men. But a living queen with symbolic power was something else entirely. So Rome developed methods that were legal, ritualized, and ruthless. Captured queens were first stripped of identity. Titles were removed. Royal clothing was taken. They were no longer addressed by name, but by status: captive, foreigner, property. This mattered. Rome understood that identity begins with language. Once a queen stopped being spoken of as a queen, she stopped being seen as one. Public display was the next step. Roman triumphs were not celebrations. They were warnings. During these parades, Rome showcased defeated leaders to its citizens. Chariots rolled through the streets. Soldiers marched in formation. And behind them came the captives, chains visible, posture controlled, dignity carefully destroyed. For male leaders, this was humiliation before execution. For queens, it was something more complex. Rome did not always kill them immediately. Sometimes, survival itself was the punishment. A queen displayed in a triumph was being rewritten. She was no longer a ruler chosen by gods or lineage. She was evidence of Roman supremacy. Every Roman citizen who watched learned a lesson without being told. This is what happens to those who challenge us. Even their queens kneel. After the triumph, the real silence began. Some queens were imprisoned for years. Not in dungeons filled with chains and screams, but in controlled confinement. Roman captivity was calculated. Isolation without chaos. Dependence without comfort. Guards who spoke Latin. Laws they could not read. Customs they could not navigate. This was psychological warfare. A queen raised to command suddenly had no one who answered her. A woman trained to speak publicly was denied an audience. Even grief was regulated. Rome understood that breaking the mind was often more effective than breaking the body. One of the most infamous examples is Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Cleopatra VII of Egypt. After her mother's defeat, the young queen was taken to Rome. She was paraded as proof that Egypt itself had been absorbed into Roman destiny. But Rome did not kill her. It raised her. Why? Because Rome was confident enough to reshape her. Cleopatra Selene was educated as a Roman noblewoman. She learned Roman customs, language, and expectations. Her past was not erased through violence, but through absorption. Rome did not always destroy queens. Sometimes it neutralized them by turning them into symbols of Roman benevolence. The message was the same. Resistance ends here. But not all queens were given that path. Others vanished into obscurity. Their names survived only in fragments, mentioned briefly by Roman historians who focused far more on generals than on women they considered irrelevant once defeated. This selective memory was intentional. To forget a queen was to finish conquering her. And then there were queens whose fate was designed to terrify. Roman law allowed enslaving prisoners of war. Queens were not exempt. Once enslaved, their bodies became property under Roman law. This was not framed as cruelty. It was framed as order. Rome did not see itself as barbaric. It saw itself as efficient. The key detail is this: Rome did not need excess brutality to make its point. The system itself was enough. Loss of autonomy. Loss of lineage. Loss of future. A queen without a throne, without a name, without a people was a contradiction Rome resolved through control. This is where modern imagination often fails. We picture violence as chaos. Rome preferred procedure. Every step was justified. Every action recorded. Every humiliation legalized. Rome taught the world that power does not need rage. It needs structure. And this structure served another purpose. It discouraged future resistance. When neighboring kingdoms heard what happened to captured queens, negotiations changed. Alliances shifted. Surrenders came faster. Rome understood that fear travels farther than legions. Yet there is a deeper layer to this story. Rome's treatment of captured queens reveals something uncomfortable about civilization itself. Rome celebrated law, order, and reason. But when those tools met female power outside Roman control, the response was elimination through humiliation. Queens threatened Rome not because they commanded armies, but because they represented alternative authority. Another center of loyalty. Another version of legitimacy. Rome could not allow that to survive intact. So it didn't. The tragedy is not just what happened to these women. It is how successfully Rome controlled how they would be remembered. Their suffering was minimized. Their stories reduced to footnotes. Their humanity overshadowed by the empire's narrative of inevitability. But history always leaks. Fragments remain. Coins. Statues. Accounts written reluctantly by Roman men who could not completely erase what they witnessed. Through these fragments, we see the pattern clearly. Rome did not simply defeat queens. It transformed them into warnings. And once transformed, it moved on. This is only the beginning of the story. Because what happened next, how Roman soldiers interacted with these women after conquest, how captivity reshaped their lives, and how some queens resisted even in silence, reveals an even darker truth about how empires maintain control. That is where we go next. Once the triumph ended and the crowds dispersed, the real purpose of Roman captivity began. Rome did not parade queens simply to humiliate them for a day. The spectacle was only the opening act. What followed was far more effective, and far more destructive. Captured queens were removed from visibility and placed into controlled isolation. This was intentional. Rome understood that public humiliation shocks, but private captivity reshapes identity. A queen who no longer saw her people, heard her language, or exercised authority would slowly lose the sense of who she had been. Rome did not rush this process. Time itself became a weapon. In captivity, queens lived under strict regulation. Their movements were monitored. Their interactions limited. Roman guards and attendants enforced rules they could not negotiate. Even basic routines, when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, were dictated. For a woman raised to command, this loss of agency was devastating. Power was not taken violently. It was quietly replaced. Roman soldiers played a crucial role in this transformation. They were not instructed to beat queens or terrorize them openly. That kind of chaos created sympathy. Instead, soldiers enforced normality. They followed orders. They remained indifferent. Indifference, Rome understood, erodes dignity faster than cruelty. A queen ignored becomes smaller than a queen abused. Some queens were assigned Roman households, forced to adapt to unfamiliar customs. Others were confined to provincial residences far from Rome itself, where no one remembered their former status. Distance was part of erasure. A queen removed from the center of attention became easier to forget. For those kept in Rome, the message was even clearer. You may live, but only as Rome allows. Roman law defined captives as property of the state. This legal framing mattered deeply. Once categorized as property, queens lost legal personhood. Their bodies, labor, and futures were no longer their own. Rome did not see this as immoral. It saw it as orderly. Conquest created ownership. Ownership created control. This is where modern discomfort often grows. We imagine that queens, because of their status, must have been protected from the worst abuses. But Roman law did not protect foreign royalty once conquered. Rank did not follow across borders. A queen outside her kingdom was simply another defeated enemy. Yet Rome was selective. Some queens were spared extreme treatment not out of mercy, but usefulness. They could be bargaining chips. Symbols of Roman magnanimity. Instruments of propaganda. By keeping a queen alive and visible under Roman supervision, Rome demonstrated not weakness, but confidence. We do not fear you enough to kill you. This calculated restraint sent a powerful message to neighboring states. But restraint did not mean freedom. Queens who survived captivity lived under constant psychological pressure. Every privilege could be revoked. Every kindness was conditional. Gratitude was expected. Compliance rewarded. Resistance punished quietly. Even motherhood, once a source of dynastic strength, became compromised. Children born in captivity belonged to Rome, not to their mother's former people. Lineage was redirected. Bloodlines were absorbed or diluted. Rome conquered not just territory, but future generations. The silence surrounding many captured queens is not accidental. Roman historians rarely recorded their inner lives. Women were not considered political subjects worth chronicling once defeated. Their suffering was administrative, not dramatic. And administrative suffering leaves fewer traces. Yet glimpses remain. We know of queens who adapted outwardly while resisting inwardly. Who learned Roman customs without forgetting their own. Who survived by becoming unreadable. Resistance did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like endurance. And endurance, in Roman captivity, was dangerous. A queen who retained dignity risked becoming a symbol again. Rome tolerated submission, not strength. The balance was delicate. Appeared too proud, and punishment followed. Appeared too broken, and you disappeared entirely. Roman soldiers, tasked with maintaining this balance, became instruments of imperial psychology. Their presence reminded queens that escape was impossible. That obedience was safer than defiance. That memory itself could be dangerous if expressed. This system worked because it was impersonal. Individual soldiers could be replaced. Orders remained. The empire did not rely on cruelty of character. It relied on obedience of structure. And structure made everything feel inevitable. Over time, captivity achieved what conquest alone could not. Queens ceased to be threats. Their names faded. Their former power became irrelevant. Rome did not need to kill them to win. It needed to outlast them. But there is a darker dimension to this story. Roman soldiers were often stationed far from home for years. They lived among conquered peoples. They enforced laws over cultures they did not understand or respect. This environment bred entitlement. Power without accountability always does. While Rome officially framed treatment of captives as regulated, reality varied. Boundaries blurred. Oversight weakened. What Rome intended as controlled domination sometimes became personal exploitation. These moments rarely appear in official records. They survive only as rumors, fragments, and silences. And silence, in history, often speaks loudest. The fate of captured queens was not uniform. Some were absorbed. Some were forgotten. Some died quietly. But all shared one truth. Rome did not allow defeated queens to return home unchanged. They returned, if at all, stripped of what made them queens. This was the real Roman victory. Not the fall of cities. Not the march of legions. But the destruction of meaning. A queen without authority, without people, without legacy was no longer a rival. She was proof that Rome could reach into the most sacred symbols of another culture and hollow them out. This understanding shaped Roman military policy for centuries. Conquest was not complete until memory was controlled. And memory, Rome learned, could be reshaped by controlling women as effectively as by defeating armies. Yet history does not belong only to those who write it. Despite Rome's efforts, these stories survived. In fragments. In foreign traditions. In echoes that refuse to disappear. Each fragment challenges the empire's narrative of benevolence and order. Because beneath Rome's laws and rituals lay a simple truth. Power that fears symbols will always try to destroy them quietly. And captured queens were among the most dangerous symbols Rome ever faced. What happened next, how some queens disappeared completely, how others were used as political tools, and how Roman memory itself became selective, reveals the final layer of this story. That is where we go next. Rome wanted these queens to disappear quietly. But history rarely cooperates completely with power. Even when names are erased and stories fragmented, meaning survives in patterns. And the pattern Rome left behind is impossible to ignore. By the time Roman soldiers finished their work, the conquered queen no longer functioned as a ruler, a rival, or even a symbol of resistance. She became something far more useful to the empire. Proof. Proof that no authority existed outside Rome's permission. Proof that lineage, divinity, and tradition collapsed when confronted with Roman order. And that proof was meant to last. Some captured queens were eventually released or married off under Roman supervision. These were not acts of mercy. They were acts of control. A queen returned home weakened served Rome better than a dead one. She carried Roman dominance back into her own people's memory. Her survival became a reminder of submission. Others were absorbed permanently into Roman society. Their children grew up Roman. Their accents softened. Their customs faded. Within a generation, the threat they once represented vanished without a single execution. Rome understood that time, guided correctly, could finish what violence began. But not all queens were allowed this slow erasure. Some disappeared completely. No records. No monuments. No burial sites. Silence where identity once existed. These disappearances were not accidents. They were the final stage of domination. When a queen vanished without trace, Rome ensured that no future rebellion could rally around her memory. You cannot resurrect what you cannot remember. This selective memory is one of Rome's most effective weapons. Roman historians celebrated conquest, law, and civilization. They rarely dwelled on what those achievements cost to the conquered. Especially not when the cost involved women whose authority challenged Roman ideals of power. Queens who ruled independently did not fit Rome's story of order. So they were minimized, reshaped, or removed entirely. And yet, despite Rome's efforts, something endured. Coins bearing queens' faces survived beneath Roman layers. Local legends persisted in conquered lands. Foreign chronicles remembered names Rome ignored. These fragments form a counter-history. One that reveals how much effort Rome invested in controlling not just territory, but meaning. The treatment of captured queens exposes a contradiction at the heart of Roman civilization. Rome celebrated law, reason, and restraint. But when confronted with female sovereignty outside its control, it responded with systematic humiliation and erasure. The issue was not gender alone. It was legitimacy. A queen embodied an alternative center of loyalty. Rome could not tolerate that coexistence. So it dismantled it. What makes this story disturbing is how modern it feels. Systems today still use similar logic. Strip identity. Control narrative. Isolate symbols. Redefine victims. Rome did not invent these techniques. It perfected them. And perfection made them invisible. Captured queens did not scream through history. They faded. And fading is often mistaken for peace. But peace achieved through erasure leaves unresolved tension. It embeds trauma beneath surface stability. It teaches societies to survive quietly rather than challenge openly. Rome ruled longer than any of its enemies. But longevity is not innocence. The empire eventually fell. Its roads cracked. Its laws fragmented. Its authority dissolved into memory. And when that happened, something curious occurred. Stories Rome tried to suppress resurfaced. Reinterpreted. Reclaimed. Queens once reduced to footnotes became symbols again, not of defeat, but of resilience. Not because they won, but because they endured. Endurance is the one thing empires struggle to control completely. It survives conquest, silence, and even forgetting. Somewhere, someone remembers differently. Somewhere, the story leaks. The Roman soldiers who guarded these queens believed they were enforcing order. In reality, they were participating in a long experiment in domination. An experiment that taught the world how power could humiliate without appearing cruel. How control could masquerade as civilization. And the queens paid the price. They were not defeated on battlefields. They were defeated in memory. And memory, once altered, shapes generations. This is why the story matters. Not because Rome was uniquely evil. Not because these queens were uniquely tragic. But because their fate reveals how easily greatness justifies destruction. Rome did not need to kill every queen it captured. It only needed to make sure none of them remained whole. And in doing so, it taught future empires a lesson they would repeat endlessly. That the most effective way to destroy authority is not to crush it publicly. It is to erase it quietly. These queens were not weak. They were overwhelmed by a system designed to outlast individuals. A system that understood power does not need to be loud to be absolute. And that understanding is Rome's most dangerous legacy. Because even now, long after its legions are gone, the methods remain.